Hey everyone. So just a quick note before we start. Levi had some trouble with his recording equipment, so we've had to use a backup recording for the first half, which doesn't sound great. But on the plus side, it gives you an insight into what Idiofacto used to sound like in the first couple of episodes, so shows you how far we've come, really. Still super interesting what he talks about, so don't let it distract you too much, and it goes back to normal in the second half of the episode. Hope you like it anyway. Join us on an investigative journey as we educate each other on a scientific discovery, concept, or phenomenon.
Then we'll take a dive into the complex and misleading world of pseudoscience to sort the factual from the fabricated.
I'm Matt McCabe.
And I'm Levi Bateman.
And this is Idiofacto.
What's the time? It's 9:15. Well, no, it's a little bit past 9 now, but I know that because I'm looking at my watch.
That's good. I'm so glad that you know what the time is.
I'm looking at my watch, I'm looking at my phone, and they've all got clocks on them. And it's a really easy way to tell the time, obviously, with a digital clock or a digital watch. You can just pull it out, but it wasn't always the case. Believe it or not.
Oh, I do believe it, yeah.
Yeah, so...
Because digital clocks are, digital.
That's right, yeah, and we haven't always had a digital system, so...
No.
Except for literally a digital system.
Yeah.
Which actually is an interesting way to sort of get into the topic, I guess. Time is based on a sexagesimal system, which means 60.
Sexadecimal or?
Sexagesimal.
Sexagesimal?
Yes, that was a new word that I'd learned as well.
Right.
Sexagesimal.
Okay.
I'm not sure why it's not sexadecimal.
Sexagesimal.
Sexagesimal, yes. And this means 60, so...
Oh, it doesn't mean that they're sexy numbers?
Well, they could be to some. Some number files, I guess.
Ooh.
But...
that takes the phrase number file to a whole nother level.
Ooh, yeah. Anyway, not kink shaming anyone. So yeah, obviously there's 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and this system of 60 was used by the Sumerians, which were an ancient civilization in about 2000 BC. And I had to do a little bit of research on them, which I won't really talk too much about, but incredibly interesting how advanced these guys were for so long ago and where they were.
But also, why are they using a sexagesimal system when it doesn't make very much sense?
Well, I will tell you exactly why. Because, so if I was to count like a metric system that uses tens and hundreds, is very, very logical and makes great sense. But
to humans, because we have 10 digits.
We do have 10 digits, exactly. But, so if you look at your hand right now, look at your left hand.
Yep.
You've got 4 fingers and a thumb, or 5. And you've got exactly the same on the other hand. But if you just use that left hand, each of your fingers has 3 sort of knuckle sections, 3 segments. Yep. So if you use your thumb and you touch a segment with your thumb, that's 1. So start on the pinky and then touch it on the next segment up, that's 2.
Yeah.
Then the next segment up is 3, and then start on the bottom one of the next finger, your ring finger, and so forth. So you've got 12 segments on each hand. And then on the other hand, so once you've been through that, you've count 10, 11, 12. On the other hand, you raise a finger. So you know that you've been through it once, and then you can do it again. So at the end, if you're counting, I don't know, rows of corn or something, I'm not sure, it may have been an agricultural system. At the end of it, if you see that you're holding up 3 fingers on your right hand and you're up to the second knuckle on your finger, you know that that's 38.
That actually makes so much more sense, because in a decimal system you go 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10, and then you go now what? How do you go to like 11?
Exactly.
Or you have to remember that you're doing 21 or 31 or whatever when you get...
like using human anatomy, it's actually a really good way to count, and it just so happens to be 60.
That's actually so clever.
Yeah.
Sorry, I apologise to the Sumerians because... Sorry for talking crap about you Sumerians, because that's actually very clever.
Well, they're not around anymore. It's actually now like southern Iraq or something like that, where Sumeria...
yeah, still.
Well, actually, Sumer was the name.
So it doesn't mean we can cast shade on them now.
Yeah, that's...
Clever people.
They were. Mm-hmm. So this is where we get the 60 from in our sexagesimal system. Now, the Egyptians were kind of some of the first people to divide the day up in, rather than just being day and night. They divided the day into like 14 parts. So there was 2 twilight sections in the morning, 2 in the evening, and then 10 throughout the day. And you could sort of measure this on a shadow clock or a sundial. You've probably heard of or seen a sundial. Yeah. Basically, all it is any object that can cast a shadow, and then you can use the sun's position and the moving shadow to work out what time it is.
But surely that changes throughout the seasons.
Exactly, it does, but that never mattered because the day was divided into 14 parts regardless of what season it was, and so which meant that in summer, an hour was a lot longer than what an hour is in winter.
Okay.
Everyone was just kind of okay with that, though.
Yeah.
In the same way that, we just accept that a day is longer in summer than it is in winter.
Yeah.
And so it was just a way that they used. But of course, if you're using a clock that uses the sun and shadows, well, it doesn't work when it's overcast. And it doesn't work at night time.
Yes.
So as soon as you lose the sun, you can't tell time anymore. Which probably doesn't really matter, but there would have come a time when people wanted to know the time. So we'll sort of move through now the different phases of timekeeping devices. And I'm not mentioning them all because some of them are just downright ridiculous. And utterly useless.
More ridiculous than a watch, though? Like, a watch is quite a ridiculous contraption when you really
No, the watch is a very, very useful bit of equipment, but...
It's useful, but it's just... do you mean ridiculous in that they're not useful?
Kind of, yeah.
Okay.
So, some of the first clocks that could be used with any sort of great accuracy at any time of the day were these water clocks. And they were fairly reliable. They didn't really have all that many moving parts. Basically, it was just a container of water in a system up the top, and it had a hole in it that leaked a certain amount of drips of water per time period, be it an hour or a minute or whatever it was. Right. And then you would just look at the container beneath it, and it had lines etched in it or drawn on it, and as the water would fill up, you'd know, oh yes, it's up to the 4th line, which means 4 hours have passed.
Right. So like an hourglass, like a sand hourglass is a similar concept to that.
Kind of water. Like that, yeah, but with water. The only problem is that water, so it's still a little bit variable because it can wear and it can rust and it can swell, and the viscosity of water changes with temperature, and water also freezes at 0 degrees. So yes. If it's frozen...
Celsius, that is.
Celsius. So if it's frozen, obviously you can't use the water clock. So for a little while, mercury was used rather than water because mercury freezes at minus 38 degrees Celsius.
Mercury has other issues.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you don't want to be too close to mercury or handling it for any great period of time. So then we sort of moved into... Or roughly, I don't have time... I don't have years against these because it was probably an unreliable, and it'd just be a guess anyway. But so after water clocks, we kind of moved into the candle clock era, and this was a clock that could be used at night time. And it was just a series of candles that were all exactly the same size, same length, same material. And if you made them in such a way that you knew that if you lit it, it would burn for exactly 2 hours. So you could light one, and as it got to the bottom and went out, then that had been 2 hours. And if you line up 6 of these candles next to each other with some sort of fuse system, so that when one candle reaches the bottom, the next candle gets lit, you know that you've got a 12-hour clock. But it's kind of wasteful, and you would obviously have to reset it, not just winding a knob, but actually remaking and replacing all of these candles into your candle clock. So that was fairly useless. Probably not as useless as... the next one that I'll just briefly touch on, which was the incense clock.
Okay.
Pretty much what it sounds like. So you've got an incense stick that burns at a given rate, not all that reliable, obviously, and every so often, every whatever the time period might have been, it would change scent.
Oh.
So you might go from sandalwood, and then when you start to hang on, the sandalwood's going, now I can smell lang lang, and oh, okay, well, 2 hours must have passed.
Okay, I see what you mean by ridiculous now.
It is ridiculous, yeah.
Because compared to a clock...
Yeah, exactly.
That is useless.
So next up, we've got hourglasses. And I think everybody's probably seen an hourglass. It's a molded glass bulb, essentially, with a pinch. It's pinched in the middle. So there's a well at the top and a well at the bottom and a very small little hole, and it's filled with sand. So the sand has to pass from the top bulb to the bottom bulb. And if you use a fairly uniform size sand, you can fairly accurately predict how long that sand is going to take to all fall through the hole. The only problem with this is it doesn't really tell you time. It sort of more is used as a counter, if you get me. So it basically it just tells you when your time is up.
So it's a timer and not a timekeeper.
It's a timer, yeah. So if you wanted it to be accurate, you'd basically have to have somebody sort of standing there, and as it reached the bottom, you'd have to flip it back over again. And
which is what they used to do on ships, like Navy ships. They used to have someone manning the hourglass, and at the end of the cycle, they would turn the glass over and ring the bell.
Yep, that's true. So, but again, like we're saying, this was probably used as a time period counter because you couldn't necessarily use it for any great accuracy of timekeeping. This sort of called for the need for something a little bit more accurate. And so we're now going to move into the era of mechanical clocks, which is probably what you've seen if you've ever looked at a grandfather clock. Any clock with a pendulum, or any older style wristwatch, or something that has a spring wheel or something like that in it. These mechanical clocks that are physical moving parts. And these were developed to begin with in the 17th century by a Dutch mathematician. I've actually got an interesting story about the first highly accurate mechanical clock. So it's got to do with navigation at sea. So to know where you are on the Earth's surface, you kind of need your latitude and your longitude. So latitude are imaginary lines that run east-west. They run around the globe. So the equator is a line of latitude. The tropics are lines of latitude.
Yep.
The circles, the Arctic and Antarctic circles, and they're always the same distance apart. They're in degrees, essentially.
And then minutes and seconds as well.
Yeah, so then we've got, that's right, so then we've got longitude, which run from pole to pole. So one of them is the International Date Line, essentially. The other one is the line that runs through Greenwich is called Prime Meridian. But before we had these, we sort of had no, extremely accurate way of knowing where we were on the Earth's surface. And before the GPS, you needed other ways to find where you were in the ocean. Obviously, if you're on land, you can use a map. You can look at the mountain, you can look at the river, the road. You know where you are, but you've got nothing when you're out at sea. So latitude is relatively easy to work out. Not for me, but if you
if you know what you're doing.
Yeah, that's right. You can look at the sun and look at its highest point in the sky, how many degrees it is from the horizon, and you can use a sextant, which is a piece of equipment that you'd have on a ship for navigation. Oh,
it's for navigation.
A sextant.
Yes. I just thought because, a ship can be a lonely place.
Elaborate on what you...
No, I think I'll just leave it to your imagination.
Okay. Anyway, while we marinate in that...
That's a poor choice of words.
Oh, God.
And also, sorry, my 8-year-old brain thinks the word sextant is funny. Sorry.
Well, you didn't laugh so hard at sexagesimal.
No, I did make a joke about it, though.
Well, yeah, okay. Anyway, so there's a few ways that you can get latitude by using that piece of equipment. But longitude, you need a clock. And you need to know the time, and fairly accurately. And this sort of sounds like a strange way to navigate with a clock, but I'll explain. And this may be difficult to explain. A podcast is not a visual medium, so we're just going to I'm going to do my best.
Well, this is where the show notes come in handy. So if you need some visual stimulus...
Exactly. I'll put in a link.
That's another poor choice of words.
Stop it.
Then check the show notes Show notes?
Show notes.
Check the show notes.
If you can check the show notes. I'll add some sort of diagram on how this works. But basically, so the Earth takes 24 hours to spin. We know this. This is the length of a day. This is pretty reliable. This doesn't vary a huge amount. So if you divide the Earth sort of lengthways into strips or lines of longitude, then you know that each one of those strips is a given time of the day away from each other. So, for example, what you would have to do, say, for example, you're in England, you're in Greenwich, and when the sun is highest in the sky, you set your highly accurate clock to midday. And then you take that clock with you onto the ocean, onto your ship, and then you travel out to sea. And so if you travel a few hundred kilometers west, and then you wait until the sun, so the next day possibly, you wait until the sun is highest in the sky again, and you look at what the clock says. And in this case, because you're so far west, the clock might say that it's 1 o'clock, whereas you set your clock to midday or 12 o'clock back in Greenwich. So you now know that your location that you currently are is 1 hour behind where you have your clock set to.
Yeah.
So once you know the time difference between your current location and the location that your clock is set to, you can look at a globe or a map and work out which one of those strips you might be in by dividing the Earth into 24 equal segments. It's actually 360 equal segments, but for the purpose of this explanation, imagine that it's 24.
Yeah.
And then once you know your longitude by looking at a clock and a map, you can get your latitude by looking at the sun with a sextant, and you can pretty well know your exact location.
So that's why it's measured in degrees, minutes, and seconds, is because
yes,
you're this many degrees, because it's 360 degrees.
Yep.
You're this many degrees, and then plus a couple of minutes and a couple of seconds, sort of.
Exactly right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So nobody these days would need a clock to know your location. You don't.
No, but longitude and latitude are still measured in degrees, minutes, and seconds, although it is moving towards a more decimal system where it's...
That's right.
Decimal degrees.
Yeah. There are all different forms of coordinate systems, and one of them is this longitude and latitude that we talked about with degrees, minutes, and seconds. But to use this system, you need a very accurate clock for this to work. You know, a lot of these older style clocks and pocket watches may lose sort of 5 minutes a day. And if you're losing 5 minutes a day over 10 weeks at sea, the watch is as good as useless for a navigation device.
Yeah, yeah.
So, you know, it's losing too much time. So this is where the longitude prize was developed. So after a spate of, there was about 4 or 5 ship accidents where navigation wasn't great, ships ran aground and there was a lot of lives lost and ships destroyed, the British government offered a large prize, of which back then it was £20,000, but it would have been the equivalent to millions of pounds today, to anybody that could come up with a way to accurately determine longitude. And so in 1735, this guy called James Harrison, he was a carpenter from Yorkshire, he started to develop this mechanical clock that was a highly accurate piece of equipment. And he took quite a number of decades to design and build and complete this clock. But eventually, he did complete it, and he tested it. His son tested it out at sea on a ship, and he spent 10 weeks at sea, and at the end of all of that, he only lost 5 seconds.
Wow.
The clock was out by 5 seconds, which was just revolutionary, as you can imagine. He used he used bearings to reduce friction. He used different types of metals to reduce the effect of temperature on componentry, because different temperatures and humidities and the like can affect friction and movement of these clock components.
It's very scientific of him.
It was, yeah.
For the time.
He was a revolutionary.
Yeah.
It was actually a bit sad, and the government was very reluctant to pay out the prize. So they said, well, that's all well.
You were still 5 seconds off.
No, it was more like you've produced one, but we need more. We need to prove that you can replicate this. So he had to produce, I think it was 5 replicas, and all of them had to work well. And eventually he did this, and he finally claimed his prize, and the British government paid him his prize money. But by this time, he was very old, and unfortunately, he died just a few years after claiming the prize. So
Right.
that's a bit sad. But his work changed the way that we built mechanical clocks. And if you've never seen a mechanical clock, the workings of it, there's a few components that are in every mechanical clock, or every clock with a pendulum. So a pendulum essentially is a big long stick with a weight on the end. And regardless of how heavy that weight is, a pendulum of the same length will always swing at the same speed. So you could have a 1 meter long pendulum, and this will take, I believe it's 1 second to swing back and forth.
Really?
Yeah, regardless of the weight. So that weight could be, 500 grams, it could be 20 kilos. It will always take the same amount of time to swing.
Really?
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, I'm struggling to get that straight in my head because I'm just trying to visualize a pendulum.
So the longer the pendulum, obviously the longer time that it takes to swing.
But it doesn't matter what the weight is.
That's right, yeah. So each pendulum clock will have obviously this pendulum, but if you just let something go, it won't just carry on forever.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
So you also have a weight. So there's a weight connected to a pulley, which is connected to a notched wheel. So the top of the pendulum has these kind of claws on it that grips onto this notched wheel. And as it swings, it only travels in one direction, and it needs to be released. So there's a release mechanism on this wheel. So because of the way that the notched wheel and the claws on the end of the pendulum are designed, it only allows the notched wheel to spin in one way, and it only allows it to spin once every second. So this is essentially your second counter. And the weight is there to put pressure on the wheel, which in turn puts pressure on the pendulum. So this obviously can't go on forever. So as the weight, goes down and down and down, using pulleys and different amount of pulleys and rigging, you can drag out the drop of the weight for a very long time, but eventually you will have to rewind this.
Insert more energy into the system.
Well, which is just a matter of opening up the case and pulling the weight back up to the top of the system.
Right.
So every mechanical pendulum clock has these sort of few components, and it's amazing how simple it is, and you could just about make one at home. Well, you could make it out of wood. It wouldn't be very accurate, but if you got the length of the pendulum right, it would work.
Yeah. It's really weird how some of the most amazing inventions that humans have come up with, in fact, some of the most amazing discoveries are so simple. In their final form, they're just so simple. Like, even evolution as a concept is just such a simple, elegant concept. But it took so long for us to figure it out, despite it being simple. And much like this, that a clock is such a simple, elegant solution.
Yeah.
But it took us so long to figure out how to do it.
You're right. And it's just that discovery. And, essentially we could have built clocks. The Sumerians, I'm not sure if they had mechanical clocks. I don't think they did. No, they wouldn't have had mechanical clocks, but they could have. This was during the Bronze Age.
Yeah.
We had metals, we had knives. I watched a video of a guy crafting a mechanical pendulum clock in his backyard with a hand lathe and, very, very simple tools.
So it's purely a matter of knowledge. It's not even a matter of technology.
Exactly, yeah. With the tools in my shed, I could make a fairly accurate mechanical clock.
Yeah, that's just amazing.
I just don't know how. So, but yeah, you're right.
That's kind of amazing to think about. What if we were able to go back and give the knowledge that we have today to someone like the Sumerians? Imagine how much technology would have progressed up until this point if they had the sort of knowledge that we did.
Yeah, absolutely. Because they obviously had the resources, because you can see some of the civilizations that they created and the buildings and things like that.
Not only the resources, but obviously the brain power. Like, they were a clever people.
Yeah.
Who focused on technological innovation, but they just didn't have the knowledge. It's just a function of the amount of time that they'd been investigating.
Yes. Yeah, if we could time travel back and give them some of the knowledge, not necessarily even the technology, imagine how advanced our civilization may be now.
Yeah, I know.
With a further
it's crazy to imagine.
5,000 years of advancement. But
I mean, it's silly to imagine. It's pointless, but...
A little bit. Well, not necessarily. When I was doing research on this, I did watch a few videos on time travel. And anyway, we'll save that for another episode. I think...
But will we put it in science or pseudoscience? That's the real question.
It might be a special episode where we talk about time and time travel. So this technology of the mechanical clock sort of revolutionized our timekeeping, and we were able to eventually build a wristwatch that kept time. Rather than using a pendulum, it would use what's called a balance wheel, which is just a sort of a flywheel, a heavy wheel that's attached to a spring. So you have to tension it.
Wind
so
it.
That's right. The spring will lose tension over a few days, so you do have to wind it, but it'll work. It'll keep this thing spinning, and it's allowed us to put a clock, or what would have been a big centerpiece or a piece of furniture in your house, a grandfather clock. You can put it on your wrist or put it in your pocket. This was incredibly advanced for the time. The first wristwatch was built in the late 19th century or early 20th century, originally for aviators and soldiers in the First World War. And it meant that you could set your watch and you could synchronize with all your other soldiers, and you could tell the time without having to take your hand off of your rifle. So, or, you could, if you're a pilot, you could just look down at your hand and you didn't have to take your hand away from any of the controls. So
I'm kind of amazed that it is that's quite recently.
Yeah, you're right.
Watches existed.
Well, we had pocket watches. We had pocket watches, but they had quite a big movement.
Wristwatches you're talking about.
This is a wristwatch, yeah, with a strap strapped around your wrist. So our sort of next huge jump in accuracy came with quartz clocks. And quartz clocks are so more advanced so more accurate than any mechanical clock that ever existed. So quartz has a certain property that if you apply a charge to it, it will vibrate at a certain frequency. And that frequency is 32,768 cycles or vibrations per second.
Hertz.
This is known as hertz, exactly. So, about 32,000 hertz, quartz vibrates. So what you can do is you can carve a little quartz crystal. We're talking microscopic. You can carve it into the shape of a tuning fork. Literally, a tiny little tuning fork, which is very cute.
Really?
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yep. And then what you can do is you can apply an electrical charge to that with a battery, and this little tuning fork will vibrate at 32,768 hertz. And then what you do is you can measure that vibration. So there is a resonance counter, and essentially all it does is it counts the vibrations. So there's, that's one vibration, 2, 3, 4. And then when it gets to 32,768, it knows that it has counted enough vibrations for there to be 1 second. So it will advance your watch one tick. 1 second.
Right.
So this is fairly accurate. This will gain or lose about 15 seconds per month, which actually is sort of...
A lot?
Yeah, it's a little bit. And it's not quite... Well, it's around about the same accuracy as the clock that James Harrison produced.
Wow.
So, but it's still great, and it's still, for most people, to lose 15 seconds in a month, or about a minute or a couple of minutes per year, is sort of no huge deal. We reset our clocks all the time,
Yeah, especially those of us who have daylight savings reset our clocks twice a year anyway. So
exactly, yeah. But this is still not really accurate enough for precision timekeeping that we need for things like GPS or like the stock exchange. Where
you're going to talk about atomic clocks?
Yes. So and I feel like this is an echo chamber. We just say this all the time, but I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because there's probably
let's say all the cliches. It's not going to go into too much detail. This is just a general overview. Do more research. Check the show notes.
See your doctor.
It's way more complicated than you realize. All the cliches.
But atomic clocks are fascinating, and we need them for something like if you listen back to, I believe it was Idiot Factor 8, maybe, could be wrong. We did an episode on GPS, and GPS is incredible, but we need highly, highly accurate clocks for it to work. And it's the same as the stock exchange when you're dealing with billions of dollars being, changing hands, and we need to know who put what bit in at exactly what time. So this is where atomic clocks come in. This uses cesium atoms. So there's a certain property of cesium that if you excite it, it will emit radiation.
How do you excite it? Do you say, hey, we're going to Disneyland?
Yeah, you treat it the same way that I treat my dog. And you say, hey, Evie.
Do you want to go for a drive?
Do you want to go for a drive? And she emits sort of vibrations and waves, and that's exactly what you do to cesium.
It's pretty reliable as well, so...
It is, yeah, you can count on that.
Is there an Evie clock?
Maybe, that's not a bad idea. I might suggest it. So essentially, it emits these cycles of radiation, or these waves of radiation, at a rate of 9,192,631,770 waves per second. And so in the same way that a quartz clock counts the 32,000 whatever hertz, an atomic clock has a counter, a little computer, and every time it does is it counts waves, and every time it gets up to 9,100,000,000 and whatever, it will advance the clock by 1 second. So this is so accurate and so reliable that an atomic clock will lose 2 seconds over about 2,000 or 3,000 years, which is a rate of about 30 billionths of a second per year.
Right, okay. That's pretty accurate.
It's fairly accurate. So this is pretty good. But
it wouldn't be a very good... If you had an atomic clock, it wouldn't be a very good excuse to be late for work, would you? Oh, sorry, my clock said I was 30 billionths of a second late.
You'd only just be late, though.
Yeah.
So this is very accurate, but the next big development is likely to be nuclear or optical clocks, which use lasers, and the lasers are stabilized with nuclear transition instead of atomic shell transition. So don't ask me what that actually means, but it's just a sentence.
But you know, both of us know exactly what that means.
Yeah, all I meant was don't ask what it means, because I'm not going to tell you because we've run out of time.
Yeah, yeah, that's it. Yeah. Oh, I know already, so you don't need to tell me.
Of course. All right. Well, we don't need to say anything more, but this is going to be the next big development in clocks, and highly accurate clocks, more accurate in fact than the current cesium atomic clock. So yeah, so I really hope that you've had a good time.
Wow.
In this segment. Have you?
No.
It's been alright?
Yeah, actually it has been really interesting. I hate to admit it, and I'm going to ignore the pun.
Well, you shouldn't, because it was excellent, but anyway.
No, we don't have time for your jokes, Levi.
I just thought I'd tick one off.
Wow, you missed mine as well.
Tick like a clock.
Yeah.
Wait, what did you say?
I said we don't have time for your jokes, but I was more subtle about it because I'm better at jokes.
Oh, I suppose. Anyway, now that we're explaining it, it's sort of. Anyway, we should probably let's move along.
I think it's time for my segment now.
It must be.
Hey again, guys, it's Editing Matt. Just before I get started on my topic this week, I want to clarify a few things. We talk about sound waves and electromagnetic waves in this segment, and sometimes it sounds like we're saying that they're equivalent, and there are some pretty subtle and non-subtle differences between sound waves and electromagnetic waves that we didn't get those subtleties across in this, but it doesn't really make much of a difference to the concepts that we're talking about. We also interchangeably refer to frequency and wavelength, electromagnetic waves. Again, for our purposes, that doesn't really make much of a difference to the point that we're trying to make. So I'm just acknowledging that we do know that there are differences between these things. It's just that for our purposes, it's pointless to make a big deal about them. So please don't write to us and tell us that we got it all wrong, because we did. And again, as always, it's an oversimplification. We're just trying to explain the concepts as easily as we can. So give us a break. So in late 2018, some companies in various parts of the world started rolling out the 5th generation of digital cellular networks. Do you know what they called it?
Oh, 5G.
5G. That is what they called it.
Yes.
Before that, do you know what the type of networks we were using were called?
4G.
4G. And before that?
3G.
3G. So 5G is simply the 5th generation of cellular networks.
Okay, makes sense.
Cellular network is hard to say.
Cellular.
Yeah.
Cellular network.
Cellular network.
Cellular.
Cell network. How about that? That's easier.
What's the cell part of it? I've never understood that.
Well, a cell is just an area of land that is covered by a single tower. Well, at least one tower. So the area of land that the towers cover is split into cells, and each cell has a different frequency to the neighbouring cell, so they don't interfere with each other.
Oh.
Yeah. Anyway, that's just a technical definition you don't really need to know, but you asked.
Cool.
So
Okay, thanks.
some people argue that why do we bother with 5G? Well, let's just go 10G and be done with it. Why not? Why are we going from 4 to 5? Why not go to 10? Obviously, they misunderstand the meaning of 5G. Obviously, we can't skip generations of technology, so
That's
5G is the best we've got.
Yes.
5G networks have started and will continue to roll out over the world in the coming years, and they provide a significant upgrade to the speed and latency of mobile networks, offering, depending on the service, a 2 to 10-fold increase in speed.
Wow. From
Yeah.
4G, and 4G is quick.
Yeah.
I think
compared
it is
to
anyway.
3G and compared to... So you can get internet speeds of up to 2 gigabits per second,
Whoa.
theoretically, which is a lot from a mobile network. It also allows up to 10 times more devices to be connected within a cell,
Ah, okay.
from about 100,000 to over 1 million.
Yeah, right. That's a lot. So how big is a cell?
It depends,
Okay.
but usually a few kilometers squared. It depends on the frequency of the signal, but we'll get into that because 5G actually requires a smaller. 5G doesn't penetrate materials as well, and it requires more signal towers because the waves don't reach as far. The signal isn't as strong.
Right. So 5G's for cities. You're not going to get 5G out in the bush.
No, because you'd have to have a tower every few kilometers. So,
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, the specifics of the technology are pretty complicated. And again, all of the cliches that we say on Idiot Factor, it's unnecessary for our purposes today. But it would probably make a good science topic in the near future, actually, electromagnetic waves. But I'll give you a general overview of the important concepts. Firstly, mobile networks work by using a device like a smartphone as a transceiver to convert digital signals to analog radio waves and vice versa. So they interpret the analog radio waves as a digital signal and display a picture on your phone. And then when you make a call, it converts the digital signal to an analog radio wave and sends it back to a tower, which then relays that to another mobile, like another smartphone. And then that transcodes it into, so you understand what I'm saying?
That's very interesting, actually. I've never really thought about it in that way, but you're right. So our digital phones, we're living in a digital age, but all of the waves, we can't change the fact that a wave is analog. Is that right?
No, that's right.
It's always going to be analog. So you need to do that conversion from analog to digital. Wow.
Yeah. As long as we're using radio waves, we will need to do that conversion. Yeah.
And even right now, I'm speaking in analog and my condenser mic is picking it up and then sending that signal to my computer that's converting it into a digital system.
Yes, that's correct.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we don't yet have a way of transporting a digital signal over the air, really.
No.
When you think about it like that.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. Interesting anyway, but unrelated really to our... this is what I mean, it will make an interesting science topic because the science behind radio waves is really interesting. But
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, in basic terms, the longer the wavelength of a radio wave or an electromagnetic wave in general, the slower the information they contain can be transmitted. So really long wavelengths can transfer information very slowly. Really short wavelengths can transfer information really quickly.
Okay.
So we've spoken about the electromagnetic spectrum in the past, but as a reminder, electromagnetic waves can have wavelengths of many kilometers in the case of ELF or extremely low frequency radio waves.
Used in submarines.
Yeah, they have wavelengths of about 100,000 kilometers.
Whoa.
Yeah, or they can have wavelengths up of about 100,000 kilometers, which is indeed extremely low frequency.
It is.
And at the other end of the spectrum, there can be wavelengths of as short as 1 picometer, which is ridiculously short.
What's a picometer?
It's very tiny. It's unfathomably small.
Right.
There's no way of verbally describing how small a picometer is.
Okay.
It's smaller than a micrometer. It's smaller than a nanometer.
Also means nothing to me.
Yeah, exactly. So when you get into measurements this small, it's really difficult to quantify on a human scale.
Yeah.
So at the other end of the spectrum to extremely low frequency, you've got gamma rays, and they can have wavelengths of a picometer.
Right.
Somewhere on the shorter end of the middle lies visible light, and they have wavelengths of between, like, visible light has wavelengths between 400 and 700 nanometers, which again is meaningless to most people. Nobody can visualize what a nanometer is.
No.
Suffice to say, it is very short.
Okay.
On the long side of visible light is infrared. So infrared meaning before red.
Right.
Or beneath red. And on the shorter side is ultraviolet. So ultraviolet meaning beyond violet.
Okay.
When you think about the spectrum, you've got red on one end and violet on the other.
Mm-hmm.
Ultraviolet rays have shorter wavelengths than infrared rays, but both of those two lie on either side of the visible light spectrum.
Okay. Yep.
So in general terms, the shorter the wavelength, the more difficult it is for the waves to penetrate surfaces.
Which is why submarines use this extremely low or ultra low frequency, because it's very, very low and it can penetrate into a depth of water. Yeah.
Yeah. So generally, radio waves with their longer wavelengths have no trouble getting through walls and forests and air and moisture and so on. But visible light, for example, has a much harder time penetrating solid surfaces, which is obvious. If you're inside and you're surrounded by walls, you don't get any light in.
Yeah.
From the outside.
But you could still hear something.
You could, which is a longer wavelength.
Okay, that makes sense. Yep.
So ultraviolet rays have an even harder time because they're much shorter wavelengths. So that's why it's more difficult to get sunburnt through a closed window, for example, despite the visible light making it through, because the ultraviolet rays are the things that really do the damage.
Oh, is
skin.
that right?
Yeah.
There you go. Okay.
So the glass basically blocks a lot of the UV light and lets in the visible light. So doesn't block all of it, and visible light can also do damage. It's a short enough wavelength that it can also do damage, but nowhere near as much as ultraviolet.
Okay.
It's all quite complicated as it usually is, but suffice to say, the shorter the wavelength, the harder the time it has penetrating surfaces. Which brings me to my next point. Traditionally, we've split the electromagnetic spectrum into two broad categories: ionizing and non-ionizing radiation.
Mm-hmm.
So we've spoken about this before as well. Everything from ultraviolet and shorter, so X-rays, gamma rays, and ultraviolet, all that, they're all ionizing radiation, meaning they're of a high enough energy level and frequency to cause damage to DNA molecules themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Everything from infrared and longer wavelengths are considered non-ionizing radiation. So that's radio waves, microwaves, all of the different frequencies of radio waves. Non-ionizing radiation is not of a high enough energy to cause damage to DNA.
And for more information on this, you can go and listen to the Idiot Factor episode on microwaves.
Yes. So current 4G networks have wavelengths of around 10 centimeters to 1 meter, somewhere in that band. And the new 5G networks would work on shorter wavelengths of potentially down to the millimeters sort of range.
Mm-hmm.
But then as they're adopted, they would still work in the 4G network range as well, and then only over time would they move towards the millimeter range. So this has led some people to suggest that being a largely unknown technology, it's unsafe to roll out on a large scale, which is my first point. It's not an unknown technology. We use the same frequency, the same waves, in radar and a whole bunch of other technologies already without incident. Or without known incident. So that's the first point. They suggest that radio frequency radiation, or RFR, some people also refer to it as electromagnetic frequency radiation or EMF radiation. You may have heard these terms. They say that these can cause a number of health issues ranging from mild headaches and pains to cancer, and particularly a type of brain tumour called glioma.
Wow.
Similar concerns were raised and are still present with all the previous generations of cellular technology. And though the process of validating these concerns is fundamentally difficult because of the ubiquity of an almost infinite number of electromagnetic waves in the air at any particular time.
That's true, yeah.
It's difficult to isolate a group of people from all types of radiation only to expose them to one type, or not to expose them to one type. So based on what we can glean from the research that we do have, is EMF or radio frequency radiation, specifically that of a mobile phone using 4 or 5G networks, dangerous to humans? In 2019, the Food and Drug Administration in the US published a study on rats in a facility that could isolate the animals from other radio frequencies. Very expensive facility that was able to do this. In it, They exposed rats to varying levels of radio frequency for varying amounts of time. And in conclusion, they determined that there was clear evidence that this exposure caused tumours in the hearts of male rats. There was some evidence of tumours in the brains of male rats, and there was some evidence of tumours in the adrenal glands of male rats.
Whoa, wait, so, okay. That's surprising.
Is it?
Well, the frequency that we have all around us was found to cause cancer.
In the hearts of male rats. Yes.
Okay. Even though it's a non-ionising radiation.
Yeah. The mechanism is poorly understood. And by that I mean nobody really gets why that is the case.
Okay.
In the fact sheet released to explain these results to the public, they indicate that the findings, and I quote, cannot be directly applied to humans for two key reasons. The exposure levels and the durations were greater than what people may receive from cell phones, and the rats received RFR across their entire bodies, which is different from the more localized exposures that humans may receive. End quote.
Okay.
I would add a third reason, which we've discussed at length in the past. Rat physiology is very different from human physiology, and conclusions from rat studies do not mean that humans would respond in the same way.
I understand that, but to, I suppose, put forward a counter-argument to that.
Yeah.
I guess the mode of action that would cause a tumour in the body of a rat, I can't imagine that it would be hugely different to the body of a human. I mean, it's still flesh, it's still cells, it's still heart and brain tissue.
Well, it is. It is quite... Yeah, I understand that argument, and that is the argument that people put forward, but it is fundamentally different. Rats, they weigh a fraction of what a human weighs, so their resistance to exposure to any sort of radiation is obviously going to be lessened. There is a very minor increase in cellular temperature that is associated with radio frequencies, and that is negligible in humans. It may not be quite so negligible in rats. There are a lot of reasons, a lot of technical reasons why we can't extrapolate human results from rat studies. That was a couple of them. I don't understand it enough to give you all of the reasons, but experts in the field have been unable to consistently replicate those results.
Okay.
However, based on those results and community concern, shall we say, about radio frequencies, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC, which you discussed when we spoke about glyphosate.
I did, yep.
They now list non-ionizing radiation as a possible carcinogen. Again, as we discussed in the glyphosate episode, this does not mean that it causes cancer.
No, it's actually even less than, I guess, what does that make it?
It's the same as coffee. It's less than red meat. Saying that something is a possible carcinogen is like saying someone is a possible shoplifter because they were in a store when there was a theft.
Right.
It's really easy to misinterpret that classification, as we discussed in the glyphosate episode. If you want more information, go and check that one out. The fact is, brain cancer rates have basically remained statistically identical worldwide for the last 30 years, meaning that since the wide adoption of mobile phones around the world, there has not been an increase in cancer rates associated with the increase in mobile phone usage.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. If these wavelengths were dangerous, we would expect to see an increase, but we don't.
Okay.
In an excellent article from Stephen Novella, who's the host of The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, which is arguably the inspiration for our own podcast.
I think so.
And he's a neurologist from the Yale University School of Medicine. He argues the following, and I'll put the link to this article in the show notes. Quote, "The research fails to consistently show any correlation between degree of cell phone exposure and risk of cancer or tumours. You can never prove zero risk, but we can say any remaining risk is likely minimal. We will have to continue to monitor risk as 5G is adopted." End quote. He also suggests the following recommendations out of what he calls an abundance of caution as a nod to the unavoidable uncertainty in the research. He certainly knows how to turn a phrase. He suggests continued research to monitor the health hazard and risk as technology evolves, common sense behaviours to reduce exposure like hands-free technology when it's convenient, and technology companies should consider features that minimise exposure of customers. But in conclusion, based on the available current evidence, there is reason to investigate electromagnetic radiation more thoroughly, but there's no reason to panic about the risks of existing or future radio frequency radiation. Hazard and risk are fundamentally misunderstood by humans, and the benefits of 5G will very likely far outweigh any potential risk.
I suppose that's it too, is that a lot of people are thinking that 5G is going to be, shall we say, more powerful? Because it's a higher number, it'll be more powerful. Therefore, the radio waves will more easily get into our brains or something. But it's actually going to be less likely, isn't it? As you're saying, because it's a higher frequency, it will struggle more to pass through our bodies.
Yeah, and it'll struggle more to pass through any other substance as well, like walls and the air and things like that. Like it's just there's no reason to think that it will be any more dangerous than the electromagnetic waves that we already have flying around, sending us TV signals or radio signals or 4G or 3G even for that matter, or any of the other radio frequencies that hang around. There's no reason to believe that this will be any more or less dangerous than that. And we haven't seen an increase in any sort of cancer related to the increase in electromagnetic frequencies, and that would be, you would imagine, the major indicator that there was something going on.
Exactly. And as you touched on before, this is not a brand new technology, or this is not a new wavelength that we've only just discovered. No. This is a wavelength that we've been using and have known about for a very long time and have been using.
Yeah, in fact, one of the concerns about 5G is that it might interfere with some of those services.
Right, yeah. So it's nothing new, really.
No, it's nothing new at all. And
it's just a new application of an already known wavelength.
Yeah. I mean, we know of all the wavelengths.
Oh, yes.
Just whether or not we can actually use them or not is for the purposes of sending a cellular signal is a different story.
Mm-hmm.
But, I mean, it's a spectrum. So, all wavelengths exist. It's just whether or not we can utilize them for certain purposes.
Mm-hmm.
There's no reason to believe that it is dangerous at this point. But all the experts are being very cautious, probably overly cautious and unnecessarily cautious at this point.
Okay.
A doctor will always advise you to drink less coffee, but a cup of coffee a day is not going to be the thing that drastically increases your risk of getting cancer.
Given everything else that we're exposed to.
Everything else that we're exposed to, yeah.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And so it's much the same with this.
Yes.
No expert is going to say, no, who cares? Expose yourself to as much 5G as you like, because however minor the risk.
Well, I think it's always important to do research on something, especially if there is any kind of fear that it may be making us ill. But I think we need to be realistic with the findings too.
Yes.
And trust the findings of experts, which is something that we always say.
Read you the first paragraph of this article by Stephen Novella. He says, imagine if a new technology was being proposed that would provide a substantial convenience to the point that most people would use it in one form or another, and our economic infrastructure would be reshaped around this new technology. However, the technology involves some risk, and scientists estimate that 50,000 people in the US would die each year as a consequence of its widespread use. There's even a risk to people who don't use the technology. With optimized safety measures and regulations, we could get this number down to 35,000 or so. Would the new technology be worth the risk?
Well, I guess it depends what the technology is, but if it's going to be implemented to and lives will be lost as a direct result, I would say that most people would say no.
I'll read the next paragraph. I am talking, of course, about automobiles.
Right.
In 2017, in the US, 37,000 people were killed in automobile accidents. The point is that we accept some risk along with the convenience of some modern technologies. We pump explosive gas into our homes to use for cooking and heating. Sometimes there is a risk-benefit. Heating homes keeps people from freezing to death, and automobiles can be used to save lives as well. But we also engage in risky pastimes, like skiing. This context is important as we consider adopting new technologies. Nothing is without risk. The best we can do is minimise risk and consider the overall risk to benefit ratio of any new technology. Demanding zero risk, however, is unrealistic and will cause more harm than it prevents.
He's a clever guy.
He is a very clever guy. Much cleverer than I will ever be. That's it for this episode of Idiofacto. Forward all suggestions, hate mail, evidence, and arguments to idiofacto@gmail.com.
And you can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and all other social platforms at Idiofacto. Links are in the show notes. But actually, do you ever check our Twitter?
No.
I haven't been on it. I have no idea. We could be receiving all of these excellent suggestions through Twitter.
No, we're definitely not doing that.
Well, if you're listening
I'll check
and you're
right now.
all right, okay, go on.
Send us a tweet. Do it now. I think we have 3 followers on Twitter.
Right. I don't personally have Twitter.
I think one of them's me.
Oh, great.
3 followers. Yeah, one of them's me. And one of them's Yeno, yeah.
Oh, great.
Hey, girls.
Who's the other individual?
My ex-housemate, Nikki.
Right. Oh, thanks, Nikki. Good to keep all of the socials alive.